I'd like to thank the Center for Bhutan and Gross National Happiness Studies for organizing this conference, for so generously hosting the presenters and participants, as well as thanking all of you for your attention this afternoon. I was thinking of the assemblies of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas that surround the mandala and feeling very anxious that I fulfill your expectations. So I will warn you at the very front that the paper that I wound up writing gradually drifted from the announced topic, so it will not quite match your expectations already. My apologies. For the benefit of some members of the audience, I would like to mention that there is an esoteric tantric tradition in Japan. That tradition is known as Shingon, which is the Japanese rendering through the Chinese of Mantrayana, and that it is a tradition that was established in the 10th century by Kukai, and which has had a very influential and important role. No, could you leave the lights on, please? Could you leave I need to read.
Can you keep the lights on? Professor needs light to read this.
Please. Yeah, I don't have a PowerPoint, so I'm a double handicap here as well. Thank you.
Or you get 30 seconds.
Thank you. Okay. I have that back on now. Okay. And that tradition continues right into the present as a very essential part. Much of the impression that people have of Japanese Buddhism has been dominated by Zen, and that distorts the understanding of the actual history and presence of Tantric Buddhism in Japan. That said, let me move into my paper. The early Tantric literature that I'm familiar with tends more toward the didactic, providing explanations and justifications for yogic and ritual practices, rather than being doctrinal discourses. While doctrine is not the focal point of intention of these tantras, doctrine and practice are necessarily engaged with one another in a dialectic relation, being referred to here as praxis. Since the tantras are not doctrinal exegeses, identifying the ideological orientations of tantra is not a straightforward matter, but rather a matter of looking indirectly, that is, from practice to the conceptual bases supporting practice. In the following, then, we are interested in looking at how some of the key Mahayana doctrinal concepts can be discerned in tantric practice. Gesundheit. These include emptiness, inherent awakening, and the dynamics of consciousness. Although these concepts are identified with Madhyamaka, Yogacara, and Tathagatagarbha strains of Mahayana thought, we want to consider them here simply as conceptual elements available for use in the development of tantric praxis. One can understand these ideas either as showing tantric practice to be valid, that is, effective form of practice, or as intended to be actualized by means of tantric practice, both ritual and yogic. This conceptual framework is important because it provides a perspective for interpreting the practice of tantric ritual within the context of Buddhist thought, instead of holding it off as separate from some other more mainstream form of Buddhism. And I'm aware right now that I'm addressing this concern to a largely Western academic audience, not to all of you who are quite comfortable with tantric practice being part of the broader Buddhist tradition. What may be the central question of Buddhist practice of all kinds is how does a practitioner act on the teachings in such a fashion as to make them actual, that is, to make them real, to realize them, not in the sense of cognitive comprehension, but as an embodied way of being. Tantric Buddhist praxis draws on a variety of Mahayana doctrinal resources, configuring these in a new way. The central action of much of tantric ritual is the ritual identification of the practitioner's body, speech, and mind with the body, speech, and mind of the deity evoked in the ritual. By focusing on ritual identification, we are able to indirectly discern those doctrines that were brought together in a new formulation, integral with Tantric practice. Impermanence as a necessary ground for transmutation. Since everything is empty of permanent, eternal, absolute, unchanging essence, everything is susceptible to change and transformation. The concept of emptiness is key not only to Madhyamaka thought, but also to locating Tantric practice in a Mahayana intellectual context. The centrality of emptiness to the early Tantric Buddhist practitioners is evident in the prominent place it is given at the beginning of the Vajrayāna Abhisambodhi. Among a variety of topics, the opening section addresses the idea that there is an Atman. Speaking to Vajrapani, known as the Lord of Mysteries, the Buddha explains that ordinary people cling to the notion of self and to the possessions of the self, and differentiate among immeasurable distinctions of the self. Beginning a course of practice, ordinary people are able to progress through a set of developmental stages. Eventually, following the instructions of a good spiritual friend, they enter a stage of special practice in which the wisdom that seeks liberation arises. This wisdom relates to the teachings of, quote, permanence, impermanence, and emptiness, and they follow these teachings. Lord of Mysteries, it is not that they understand emptiness, non-emptiness, permanence, and annihilation. Rather, one should realize that emptiness is dissociated from annihilation and permanence. What is particularly noteworthy here is that a central doctrine of Madhyamaka teaching, that is, the teaching that emptiness is distinct from annihilationism and eternalism, is not argued for, but instead is simply taken for granted as something that one should realize. Perhaps most importantly, Madhyamaka thought provided a view in which, because there is no permanent, unchanging essence, everything that exists is subject to change and transformation. Buddhas and Tantric practitioners are equal in having no permanent, unchanging essence, and in ritually actualizing this, Tantric practitioners are equal to Buddhas. The universal potential for awakening. Key to Tantric praxis is the idea that all sentient beings are always and already awakened. One expression of this is the concept of Tathagatagarbha, the embryo of the thus come one. This concept was subject to two different interpretations, one that practice creates awakening, and the other that practice reveals it. One of the key sources for this idea was the aptly named Tathagatagarbha Sutra. Vesna Wallace explains that, quote, according to the Tathagatagarbha Sutra, which identifies all sentient beings with the embryo of the Tathagata, the Buddha sees with his divine eye that all sentient beings are endowed with the Buddha's knowledge, the Buddha's eyes, and the Buddha's body. This view of all sentient beings as being endowed with the embryo of the Tathagata has lent itself to two different interpretations. One is that the Tathagatagarbha refers only to sentient beings' potential for spiritual awakening, and the other is that the presence of the Tathagatagarbha in every sentient being implies that all sentient beings are fundamentally enlightened, but need to recognize it. Close quote. Whether as potential to be actualized or actuality to be realized, inherent awakening provides a motivating basis for Tantric practice. Fundamental turning over. Revolution at the base of consciousness is a Yogacara conception that provides a conceptual grounding for the idea of the efficacy of Tantric practice. In broad summary, Yogacara thought divides consciousness into the 6 sensory realms, the mind, and the underlying continuum of consciousness. Turning over at the base of consciousness is the key to awakening, freeing the practitioner from the delusion of a separate autonomous self, from the dualistic knowledge to wisdom. The mind appropriates the activity of the alaya vijnana, the underlying consciousness, as its self, and then clings to that self as its object. After the fundamental turning over, the appropriation of the alaya vijnana as Atman is extinguished. This is tathata, which is not a thing or entity, but a descriptive term for the activity of cognizing things just as they are. Vasubandhu, in his 30 verses, concludes by saying, without thought, without conception, this is the supramundane awareness, the overturning of the root, the ending of the two barriers. It is the inconceivable, wholesome, unstained, constant realm, the blissful body of liberation, the Dharma body of the great sage. It is not the claim here that Tantric practitioners were or are necessarily consciously familiar with the philosophical details of Mahayana thought, either as they constructed Tantric rituals or as they performed them. Instead, Mahayana teachings, such as emptiness, inherent awakening, and fundamental transformation, were in their intellectual milieu, and in that milieu provided ways of thinking about how rituals are effective. That is, that the fundamental transformation of body, speech, and mind is possible through practice. One explanation of the efficacy of visualizing the Buddha provides an instance of this way of thinking about the process of awakening by ritual identification between practitioner and Buddha. Tantric practice developed complex visualizations, such as, for example, visualization-based deity meditation or deity yoga. One Buddhist explanation for the efficacy of visualization practice in the form of deity yoga is found in what is conventionally known as the Amitāya's Contemplation Sutra, the Amitāya Jnani Sutra. As a consequence of sectarian history in Japan, Western scholarship generally classifies this as a Pure Land text, which is unfortunately all too often foreclosed consideration of its relation to Tantric Buddhist thought. Let us consider what the Contemplation Sutra says about how visualization practice is effective. At the core of the Contemplation Sutra is a 13-step visualization sequence that the Buddha Shakyamuni teaches to Queen Vaidehi when imprisoned by her son. The sequence begins with visualizing the setting sun and proceeds to build up an image of Sukhavati, Devachan, the land of bliss. Following the 12th step, which is visualizing the lotus throne of Amitāyas, the Buddha explains the reason for this practice. And again I quote, "The Buddha said to Ananda and Vaidehi, 'After you have seen this, next visualize the Buddha.' Why the Buddha? Because Buddha Tathagatas have cosmic bodies, and so enter into the meditating mind of each sentient being. For this reason, when you contemplate a Buddha, your mind itself takes the form of his 32 physical characteristics and his 80 secondary marks. Your mind produces the Buddha's image and is itself the Buddha. The ocean of perfectly and universally enlightened Buddhas thus arises in the meditating mind. For this reason, you should single-mindedly concentrate and deeply contemplate the Buddha Tathagata, the Arhat, and the perfectly enlightened one." In this instance, the efficacy of visualization practice is explained in terms of the identity of Buddha and practitioner, that is, the interpenetration of the Buddha and practitioner. Ritual identification in Tantric thought. Ritual identification is a central segment of a ritual in which the practitioner visualizes identity with the deity evoked. Ritual identification is the expression in action of an idea that is central to Tantric conceptions of the ground, path, and goal. This organizing idea is that the practitioner is already inherently pure and identical with the Buddhas. In other words, one is already awakened from the very start. The ground is identical with the goal. The path, then, is the way of realizing, again literally making real, that always and already awakened state. Ritual identification is one of the tools for this realization. By enacting the identity of practitioner and Buddha, the practitioner actualizes his own potential, Tathagata. As practiced today in the Tantric Shingon tradition of Japan, ritual identification comprises 3 ritual acts, one each for the identification of the practitioner's body with the body of the chief deity, for the identification of the practitioner's speech with the speech of the chief deity, and one for the identification of the practitioner's mind with the mind of the chief deity. In order, these are the interpenetration, thank you. These are the interpenetration of self and deity, primary recitation, and syllable chakra contemplation, Akshara chakra. Turning to a specific ritual manual, we can better understand this threefold identification as it is actually performed. That specific ritual is the Achalanata Vidyaraja Shataka Homa of the Chuin lineage, which is paradigmatic for other Homa of the Shingon tradition. This is because it is the ritual that a Shingon Acharya learns in the training program offered on Mount Koya in the present. As indicated in the title of the ritual manual, the chief deity with whom the practitioner identifies is the immovable wisdom king, Achalanata Vidyaraja. Mutual interpenetration, identity of body. Making the mudra of Amitabha Samadhi, the practitioner recites, quote, I have now become Tathagata Mahavairocana, adorned with the perfection of all merits, and I sit in the mandala surrounded by a multitude of saintly beings. These beings, already awakened in the like manner, sit in the mandala and directly face me. The deity enters into my person, empowering and protecting me, and gives me the ultimate benefit. I enter into the person of the chief deity, where I revere and honor him, making offerings to him, and it is herein that I truly awaken to and attain to all of his qualities. I am one with the deity. There is no duality existing. Next is the primary recitation, which is the identity of speech. Holding his hands in the teaching mudra, with the beads strung between them, the practitioner recites the mantra of Achalanata Vidyaraja 108 times. Thus, the mantra is identical with the deity, is identical with the practitioner reciting the mantra. The syllable chakra contemplation is the identity of mind. Thank you. Again, forming the mudra of Amitabha Samadhi and viewing a diagram of the chakra of the imperishable, the Akshara chakra, the practitioner recites a short text in which each of the 5 syllables is associated with the ungraspability of a doctrinal concept, realizing the emptiness of these categories of things that might otherwise be thought to be permanent, eternal, absolute, or unchanging. The practitioner's realization of the emptiness of all of these means an identity with the mind of the Buddha, who also realizes the emptiness of all of these things. The holistic character of Tantric practice, as a lived practice, is best understood by seeing the practice of ritual identification as integral with key Mahayana concepts, not only emptiness, but also inherent awakening, and the fundamental transformation of body, speech, and mind. A long-standing tendency in scholarly study of Buddhism has been to focus on its doctrines as if they were abstract philosophical concepts. Focusing on doctrine to the exclusion of practice, that is, focusing on doctrine in isolation, is not adequate to understanding the lived religion of Buddhists over 2.5 millennia of Buddhist history. It is necessary to understand what people think and what they do, while recognizing that thought and action, practice and doctrine are integral to one another. Working from fundamental concepts of Mahayana thought, early Tantric practitioners formulated a new configuration of doctrine. Rather than being expressed in doctrinal discourses, that new configuration can be discerned in the practice of ritual identification. The 3 dimensions of ritual identification, body, speech, and mind, points to a holistic transformation of the practitioner realizing inherent awakening. Thank you very much.